Capture February 11th, 1973, 0947 hours. The SA-7 missile tore through the left engine of Captain Lynn Genther's A-7D Corsair II, 30 miles northwest of the plain of Jars. The world became fire and noise, a symphony of mechanical failure as the master caution lights flashed in a frantic, unheeded rhythm. The cockpit filled with smoke and screaming alarms. He had 3 seconds to decide. The aircraft rolled inverted. Genther pulled the ejection handle. The seat fired him into freezing air at 400 knots. The violent deceleration felt like hitting a wall. The parachute deployed with a crack that compressed his spine. Then a profound, ringing silence rushed in to replace the jet's scream as he floated beneath the white nylon canopy. Below, the jungle canopy stretched endless and alien green. He had 90 seconds before landing. His survival radio was already broadcasting its lonely signal. Rescue choppers, scrambled from Nakhon Phanom, would need 20 minutes minimum. The Pathet Lao guerrillas on the ground would need 5. Genther hit the trees hard. Branches tore at his flight suit like claws as he crashed through the canopy, his parachute tangling in the upper limbs. He dangled 15 feet above the jungle floor, the leg harness cutting deep into his thighs. Blood, warm and sticky, ran from a gash above his left eye. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard voices, Laotian, close, moving fast and with purpose through the dense undergrowth. He triggered the parachute, quick release, and dropped. A fresh spike of pain shot through his right ankle as he hit the ground and rolled into the brush. The voices grew louder, punctuated by the excited barking of dogs. Genther dragged himself behind the massive trunk of a fallen teak tree and drew his service pistol. 12 rounds. Against how many? The .38 Special felt like a toy, a desperate, pointless gesture against rifles designed for war. They came through the trees in a loose, practiced line. 7 men, Pathet Lao militia, in mismatched olive uniforms, carrying Chinese Type 56 rifles with a casual familiarity. A mangy German shepherd mix strained at a rope leash, its nose to the ground. The point man spotted the parachute hanging like a ghost in the canopy and shouted. They fanned out, their movements efficient, sweeping the area. Genther weighed his options, fire and take 3, maybe 4, before they cut him down in a bloody final fusillade. Or surrender and hope the ceasefire held long enough for a prisoner exchange. The Paris Peace Accords had been signed January 27th, 2 weeks ago. The war was supposedly over. A firefight here felt like a pointless, final betrayal of that hope. Dying for a war that had been officially concluded on paper was a fool's death. He placed the pistol on the ground and stood slowly, hands raised high above his head. The rifle butts came fast with no hesitation. One caught him in the kidney, stealing his breath. Another slammed into his stomach. He went down gasping for air on the damp jungle floor. Rough hands yanked his arms behind his back. Wire, not rope, bit into his wrists. Cold, sharp-edged electrical wire twisted tight until the edges cut skin. The militia commander, a stocky man with a flash of gold teeth, shouted questions in guttural Laotian. Genther gave name, rank, and service number. Nothing else. A boot caught him squarely in the ribs for his silence. They marched him northeast for 6 hours. His injured ankle swelled painfully inside his boot until each step brought fresh, searing agony. The jungle pressed close, its humidity a physical weight that turned his flight suit into a sweat-soaked second skin. The rotting vegetation smell of the monsoon season was thick in the air. Leeches, sleek and black, found the exposed skin at his collar. The guards laughed when he tried to shake them off. At dusk, they reached a muddy dirt road where a Soviet Gazi 69 truck waited, its engine idling. 20 prisoners were already crammed into the covered bed. Americans, Air Force flight suits, Navy patches, 1 Marine, their faces, illuminated for a moment by a guard's flashlight, carried the same hollow-eyed look of men who had been down longer than days, weeks, months. It was a particular kind of emptiness, the look of men stripped not just of their freedom, but of hope itself. A guard shoved Gwenther into the truck. The air inside was thick and foul, a compound of unwashed bodies, diesel fumes, and stale fear. He landed hard against another prisoner, a pilot whose name tag read Bailey. The man helped him sit but said nothing. The others said nothing. The engine groaned, and the truck lurched forward into the enveloping darkness. They drove through the night on roads that barely existed. The truck bottomed out in deep ruts, slamming prisoners against the hard metal bed. No one complained, no one spoke. In the suffocating blackness, Gwenther heard only the ragged sound of breathing and the occasional sharp intake of breath or low whimper when the truck hit a particularly deep hole. His wrists throbbed where the wire cut deeper with each violent jolt. Dawn came with a grey finality. The truck stopped at a checkpoint where Laotian and North Vietnamese soldiers inspected the driver's documents. Beyond the checkpoint, the jungle abruptly gave way to cleared land. Rice paddies stretched in neat, flooded geometric patterns. Water buffalo stood motionless in the fields, like ancient statues. It was a different world than the wild mountains they had left behind. The prison camp appeared as the sun crested the verdant hills. Ban Nakai Noya. The name meant nothing to Gwenther then. Later he would learn it was one of the smallest, most isolated facilities in the Pathet Lao system. 40 prisoners maximum. No Red Cross, no international observers. Hidden away in a remote river valley that American maps designated simply as uninhabited. The compound consisted of 6 bamboo longhouses surrounded by a single fence of woven bamboo and barbed wire. Guard towers stood at 2 corners, 1 gate. The fence was laughable by military standards, but the true prison wasn't the flimsy bamboo and wire, it was the geography. The jungle was a green wall in every direction, and the mountains beyond were impassable terrain controlled by forces who would offer no quarter. Guards herded them from the truck like livestock. Processing took 5 minutes. A Pathet Lao officer confiscated watches, rings, dog tags, and any remaining survival gear. Everything went into small cloth bags tagged with prisoner names written in wavering Laotian script. Gwenther's wedding ring disappeared into a bag he would never see again, the last tangible piece of his other life gone. Its absence was a cold phantom ache on his finger. The wire on his wrists stayed. The camp commander spoke minimal English. He was a thin, sallow man with a permanent rattling cough, younger than Gwenther expected, maybe 30. He read from a prepared statement about American war crimes and just punishment, mentioning lenient treatment for those who cooperated. His voice was flat, carrying no conviction. He seemed bored by his own words. Gwenther was assigned to Longhouse 3. The structure measured 40 feet by 15 feet and held 16 men on rough bamboo sleeping platforms. The roof leaked. The floor was packed dirt. A bucket in the corner served as the latrine. The smell hit him like a physical force, the acrid stench of sickness and despair. It was the smell of men stripped of all dignity, human waste, unwashed bodies, infection and rot. The men inside barely looked up. They had learned that new arrivals meant nothing except more competition for the meagre rations. A Navy lieutenant named Carmichael, his face gaunt, pointed to an empty platform. Gwenther sat. The wire on his wrists had cut deep enough that blood dripped onto his filthy flight suit. Carmichael produced a piece of sharpened bamboo and, with practiced motions, worked at the twisted wire for 10 minutes before it finally came free. The sudden, painful rush of blood to Gwenther's hands brought tears to his eyes. Roll call came at 1700 hours. The guards shouted, "Talubian!" and prisoners assembled in 3 ranks outside the longhouses. A Pathet Lao officer counted, recounted, counted again. The process took 30 minutes in the oppressive heat. Anyone who moved was struck with a bamboo rod. Anyone who spoke was struck harder. The sun baked the parade ground until men swayed on their feet from heat and weakness. Dinner was rice. A single scoop of white rice in a tin bowl. 1 cup per man. No vegetables, no protein, just rice that tasted of mildew and the small black insects that crunched between the teeth. Genther ate every grain. He was hungry enough that it almost tasted good. Night brought mosquitoes in relentless swarms. They found every exposed inch of skin. The prisoners had no nets, no repellent. They endured because there was no alternative. Some men wrapped their heads in torn cloth. Others simply lay still, offering themselves to the swarm, conserving what little energy they had. Genther did not sleep. The bamboo platform was too hard. His ankle throbbed, his wrists burned. Around him men coughed and shifted and muttered in their troubled dreams. Someone prayed in Spanish, someone else wept quietly into his hands. In the darkness, Carmichael whispered facts, his voice a dry, barely audible rasp. The camp had operated since 1970. Prisoners came and went, but none had ever been officially released. The guards were mostly local Pathet Lao militia, poorly trained, poorly motivated. They gambled constantly, drank potent Lao rice whiskey, and sometimes forgot to post sentries at night. The camp ran on a fragile combination of routine and apathy rather than rigid discipline. The most important fact: the guards kept all confiscated prisoner items in a single storeroom in the commandant's quarters. One room, one lock, a simple mass-produced Chinese padlock that 6 men had already studied through the building's single window. Genther listened, his mind cataloguing the information automatically. Pilot training, threat assessment, tactical analysis. The camp was not a fortress, it was barely a prison. The guards were not elite troops, they were peasants with rifles who clearly wanted to be somewhere else. Dawn came with more rain. The monsoon had started early this year and showed no signs of stopping. Water poured through the longhouse roof, turning the dirt floor to mud. Prisoners bailed with tin cans, but the water came faster than they could work. Morning roll call in the driving rain, the same counting. The same standing in ranks while guards verified numbers against their lists. Genther noticed the officer in charge could barely read. He moved his finger along the name slowly, lips forming each syllable. When he reached a name he could not pronounce, he simply skipped it. Breakfast was rice, lunch was rice. The routine established itself with brutal simplicity. Roll call, food, work detail repairing the guard quarters. Roll call, food, sleep. The days blurred together by design, calculated to break the mind through monotony, the body through hunger, and the spirit through hopelessness. But on the 3rd day, Genther saw something that cut through the monotony like lightning. During afternoon work detail, he watched a guard unlock the storeroom to retrieve a prisoner's boots. The guard fumbled with the padlock, turned the key the wrong way, and cursed. Then he did something remarkable. He pulled a thin piece of wire from his pocket, not to pick the lock, but simply to clear debris from the primitive mechanism. The guard cursed it again, then the padlock clicked open. To the guard, it was a minor annoyance solved. To Genther, observing from 20 feet away, the moment was crystalline. A key hadn't just turned in the lock, a switch had flipped in his mind. Hope, cold and analytical, began to take root. The guard had shown him exactly how vulnerable the camp's security was. That night, lying on his bamboo platform, while rain hammered the roof, Captain Lin Genther began to plan. The Paris peace accords promised prisoner release within 60 days. But peace was an idea for men in clean suits in Paris. Here, there was only the rain, the rice, and the guards' apathy. Promises meant nothing. Men had been in Ban Nakai Noya for 3 years. The Pathet Lao answered to no one. He thought about the wire that had bound his wrists. He thought about the guard fumbling with the lock. He thought about his wedding ring in that storeroom, and the survival radio and the maps. Everything needed for escape sat behind one simple Chinese padlock in a camp run by guards who sometimes forgot to stay awake. Carmichael's assessment had been almost perfect, but he had been wrong about one thing. Prisoners did leave Ban Nakai Noya. They would just have to leave on their own terms, under their own power. Chapter 2. The camp reveals itself in pieces. First comes the bamboo fence, 15 feet high and bound with rattan, surrounding a compound no larger than a baseball diamond. Then the guard's hut, elevated on stilts with a rusted sheet metal roof. Finally, the prison itself, a low bamboo structure with a thatched roof, windowless, divided into 2 rooms by a bamboo partition. This is Ban Hoe Het, though Dengler won't learn the name for weeks. What he learns immediately is that 6 other men are already here, their hollow eyes tracking his arrival with the wary recognition of those who have survived beyond hope. They are ghosts in waiting, and Dengler, fresh from the sky, feels like a garish intrusion into their purgatory. The guards unlock his ankle shackles, but leave the iron cuffs on his wrists. Inside the prison hut, the air is thick with the smell of human waste and rot. The stench hits him like a physical blow, a cocktail of ammonia, mildew, and something acridly sweet he recognizes as decay. The floor is bare earth, trampled into a slick paste by monsoon rains that pour through gaps in the thatch. 5 Americans and 1 Chinese. They huddle against the far wall, their emaciated bodies reduced to angles and shadows. No one speaks, the silence in the hut as heavy and suffocating as the humid air itself. The guards shove Dengler inside and slam the bamboo door, securing it with a heavy wooden crossbar and a rusted padlock. Roll call happens at dawn. The crossbar scrapes, the door opens, and guards shout in Lao. The prisoners stumble outside, feet caked in mud, and line up facing the guard's hut. Dengler learns the routine through observation and the sharp impact of a rifle butt when he moves too slowly. Stand straight, eyes down, don't speak. The head guard, a stocky man the Americans call Moose for his thick neck and brutal demeanor, walks the line, counting heads in Lao. When he reaches Dengler, he stops. Without warning, he drives his fist into Dengler's stomach. The pilot doubles over, gasping, air driven from his lungs in a searing explosion of pain. Stars flash behind his eyes. Before he can recover, Moose grabs his hair, yanks his head up, and spits in his face. The warm spittle runs down his cheek, an intimate act of degradation. This is the introduction. This is the establishment of order. Work begins immediately after. The prisoners are marched single file along a muddy trail that winds through jungle so dense the canopy blocks the sun. 2 guards follow, AK-47s slung casually across their shoulders. After 20 minutes, they reach a clearing where freshly cut bamboo lies in piles. The work is simple and backbreaking. Carry the bamboo poles back to camp. Each pole is 12 feet long and weighs 60 pounds. Dengler's wrists are still cuffed, making balance impossible. He watches the other prisoners. They've learned to cradle the poles across their shoulders, using their bound hands to stabilize the load. The first pole Dengler lifts slips immediately, crashing into the mud. A guard screams and kicks him in the ribs. He tries again, pushing through the fire in his ribs. The rough bark of the bamboo digs into his shoulder, the 60-pound weight driving him forward in a staggering walk. Every step is a battle. His bare feet find every sharp root and jagged rock hidden in the muck. By the time they return to camp, the flesh on his shoulder is raw and bleeding through his tattered shirt. The bamboo is for expanding the fence. The Pathet Lao are building fortifications, expecting an offensive. This is useful information, though Dengler doesn't yet understand why. He's too focused on breathing, on standing, on not collapsing. The prisoners stack the poles near the perimeter, then repeat the journey. 6 trips, 7, 8. When the sun reaches its peak, the heat becomes viscous, pressing down like a wet wool blanket, making each breath a conscious effort. Sweat streams into Dengler's eyes, stinging and blurring his vision, which begins to shrink to a narrow tunnel. The world outside this pinprick of focus becomes a shifting, indistinct mess of green and brown. He feels a wave of dizziness, his knees threatening to buckle, when one of the Americans, a tall, skeletal figure he'll later know as Jean de Bruin, a civilian contractor captured the previous September, grabs his arm. Sip water slow, De Bruin whispers in English. Don't gulp. The guard doesn't notice the exchange or doesn't care. They return to the prison hut as shadows lengthen. The meal is a tin cup of rice water, a thin gruel with a few grains floating like debris. No protein, no vegetables, just starch and water. The prisoners receive it in order of seniority. De Bruin first, then Dwayne Martin, a helicopter pilot shot down 2 months before Dengler. Martin's face is gaunt, his eyes sunken, but his hands are steady when he accepts the cup. He drinks half, then passes the precious cup to the next man. Dengler watches, dumbfounded by the simple, profound act. It is a quiet rebellion, a declaration that their captors could break their bodies, but not their humanity. This is the system they've developed. Share everything. Survive together or die alone. It is the first authentic glimmer of hope he has felt. By the end of the first week, Dengler understands the camp's rhythm. Dawn roll call. 8 hours of hauling bamboo or digging trenches near the fence line. Evening meal, lockdown at dark. The guards rotate in 8-hour shifts, 3 men on duty, 2 sleeping in the elevated hut, 1 patrolling. The patrol pattern is lazy, a circuit of the fence every 30 minutes, sometimes longer if the guard stops to smoke. Dengler notices this without intending to. It becomes a subconscious exercise, a pilot's habit of constant situational awareness repurposed for a new, grim environment. His mind, starved of any other stimulus, latches onto these details like a lifeline. He isn't thinking of escape yet, not consciously. He is simply mapping his cage, learning its contours and its weaknesses out of a primal instinct. Guard tower positions, blind spots where jungle growth obscures the fence, the location of the tool shed where machetes and axes are stored each night. 3 weeks become 6. The work changes. Instead of bamboo, they dig a trench for a new latrine. The soil is clay mixed with roots, and the guards provide a single shovel for 6 men. They take turns, passing the tool wordlessly, each man working until exhaustion forces him to stop. Dengler's hands blister, then the blisters pop and bleed. Then calluses form over the raw flesh. His weight plummets at an alarming rate. He feels his body actively cannibalizing itself, muscles withering, fat reserves disappearing entirely. The rice water diet is slow starvation, a mathematical certainty. Each day, his body consumes more calories than it receives. The deficit accumulates. The outlines of his bones become sharp and prominent, his cheeks hollowing out as his ribs emerge from his torso like the hull of a shipwreck. The prisoners speak in fragments, short exchanges when guards are distant. Dengler learns their stories in pieces. De Bruin was flying supplies for Air America when his plane was hit. Martin's helicopter went down during a rescue mission. Pisidi Indradat, the Chinese prisoner, was a Thai Air Force observer captured on a reconnaissance flight. There are 2 more Americans, YC-2 and Fisit Intharathat, but they speak little, their silence a symptom of longer captivity. Then there's Dwayne Martin's co-pilot, whose name Dengler never learns before the man dies on the 40th day. It happens during work. The co-pilot simply sits down in the trench, his shovel slipping from his hands. He looks at Martin and says, "I can't." Then he topples forward. No guard reacts. They've seen it before. De Bruin and Martin drag the body to the edge of the jungle. The guards don't permit burial, so the remains are left for scavengers. Dengler watches this clinical disposal of a human being and feels a final part of himself calcify. The shock of his capture is incinerated, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged resolve. Hope was a passive luxury he could no longer afford. This was not the death of hope, but its transformation into something harder and infinitely more useful. Pure, unyielding determination. By the 2nd month, Dengler begins to see the camp differently, not as a prison, but as a system with flaws. The guards are not professional soldiers. They're village militia, poorly trained, often bored. They carry weapons but handle them carelessly, slinging rifles across their backs while they smoke or squat to relieve themselves. their attention on anything but the skeletal figures working yards away. The padlock on the prison hut door is a mass of orange rust, the hasp secured with a simple bolt that looks alarmingly easy to manipulate. The fence, for all its height, is bamboo, strong but not unbreakable, and the jungle beyond is both barrier and opportunity, dense enough to hide in, close enough to reach. De Bruin is the one who first speaks of escape, not openly, not as a plan, but as a shared understanding. During a water break, while guards lounge in shade 50 yards away, De Bruin leans close to Dengler. "You see the tool shed?" he asks. Dengler nods. "Locked at night, but the lock's worse than ours." De Bruin's voice is barely audible. "Machetes, maybe a map if we're lucky." Dengler processes this. A machete means movement through jungle. A map means direction, but it also means violence, risk, and the certainty of execution if caught. The thought sends a cold spike through his gut, but it's followed by a surge of something else, a flicker of life in the numb expanse of his existence. He looks at De Bruin's face, etched with suffering, and sees no fear, only methodical calculation. This man has not surrendered. He has been watching, waiting, and planning. The mental shift happens during the 10th week. Dengler is hauling bamboo when he hears it, the distant buzz of an aircraft engine. American. He knows the sound of a sky raider, the way a musician knows a particular note. It is the sound of home, of power, of a world he once belonged to. The guards hear it too, their bored indifference instantly replaced by panicked shouts, driving the prisoners towards the tree line for cover. But in those seconds before they reach the jungle, Dengler looks up through a gap in the canopy and sees it. A single reconnaissance plane flying low, following the river valley 3 miles west. For one beautiful, agonizing moment, he is connected to that world again. It's searching for downed pilots, for signs of life for him. And he can't signal, can't shout, can't do anything but watch it disappear over the ridge. The engine noise fades, swallowed by the jungle's immensity, and the silence it leaves behind is deeper and more profound than any he has yet experienced. That night, locked in the hut, Dengler stares at the bamboo ceiling and understands something fundamental. The war is still being fought, planes are still flying. Rescue is possible, but only if he can reach them. Waiting for liberation is fantasy. The camp is too remote, too well hidden. Survival means escape, and escape means preparation. He looks at his wrists, at the iron cuffs still locked tight after 70 days. They have become a part of him, a constant, abrasive reminder of his captivity. The metal has rubbed his skin raw, leaving permanent scars of keloid tissue on his wrists. But as Dengler examines the cuffs in the dim light, he sees them not as a symbol of bondage, but as a mechanical object, a problem to be solved. He notices something his despair had previously obscured. The lock mechanism is simple, a pin and tumbler design, crude, possibly pickable. He's no locksmith, but he grew up poor in Germany after the war, learning to fix and improvise anything mechanical. Locks are just puzzles, and he's good with puzzles. The next morning, during the march to the worksite, Dengler scans the ground for anything metal, a nail, a piece of wire. He finds it half buried in mud. A bent nail 3 inches long, rusted but intact. When the guard isn't looking, he steps on it, driving it deeper into the soft earth, then retrieves it with his toes, tucking it against the arch of his foot. His heart hammers, but his expression remains blank. That night, while the other prisoners sleep, Dengler begins. He probes gently, translating the faint vibrations into a mental map of the mechanism. After an hour of painstaking work, he feels a final tumbler give way. A soft click, almost inaudible, echoes in his skull. The cuff springs open a fraction of an inch. Dengler freezes, breath caught in his throat, listening for any alarm. There is only the chirp of crickets. He lets out a slow, silent breath and carefully closes the cuff again, leaving it unlocked but appearing secure. Now he knows. The first link is broken. When the time comes, he can free himself. Chapter 3. The Breaking Point. February the 12th, 1966. The splash of mud and the sound of boots on wet bamboo stopped directly outside Dieter Dengler's cell at precisely 0400 hours. A change in routine signified danger. There were 3 guards, not the usual 2. The third carried a length of coarse rope, not a bowl of rice. Through the narrow slats of his cage, Dengler's eyes tracked their movements as they unlocked Dwayne Martin's cage across the damp clearing. Martin, looking gaunt and resigned, didn't resist as they wrenched his arms behind his back, binding his wrists tightly. They prodded him with their rifles, pushing him toward the jungle trail. It was a path that led nowhere, a dead end except for the steep-sided ravine where in previous weeks the prisoners had learned to strain their ears, marking the passage of time by the chilling echo of single gunshots. Dengler's hands clenched to the bamboo bars of his cage, the rough material driving sharp splinters deep into his palms. He didn't feel the pain. His entire being was focused on the small procession as Martin, a fellow American, disappeared into the pre-dawn gloom. The guards' voices, typically a low murmur, faded into the oppressive humidity of the jungle. Then came the silence. It was a heavy, absolute quiet that felt physical, pressing against the eardrums like profound depth pressure, amplifying the frantic beat of his own heart. Dengler began to count, marking time by the pulse hammering in his throat, a desperate metronome against the suffocating stillness. He reached 187 seconds. The sharp, definitive crack of a rifle shot split the morning air, a sound so stark it seemed to tear the fabric of the world. 1 shot. After a moment, the sound of boots returned. 3 sets now, the men conversing casually in Pathet Lao, their voices untroubled as they discussed the morning's breakfast. The calculation formed instantly, bypassing the fog of malnutrition and moving with cold mathematical certainty. This was not random cruelty. The Pathet Lao were executing their American prisoners systematically. It was a methodical disposal, not a chaotic massacre which might draw unwanted international attention. They were eliminating them one by one every few weeks, erasing the embarrassing and politically inconvenient evidence of the POWs they couldn't officially acknowledge holding. Dwayne Martin was this week's victim. Dieter Dengler would be next week or the week after. The specific timeline was unknowable, but the endpoint was now absolute and terrifyingly clear. Something fundamental inside Dengler shifted. The shallow conservation mode respiration he had meticulously maintained for months to save energy suddenly deepened, his lungs expanding with a gasp. A rush of oxygen flooded his system, clearing the mental fog that had settled over his higher thinking since his capture in November. He unclenched his hands from the bamboo and looked down at them, seeing them not as the withered appendages of a prisoner, but as instruments. These were not the hands of a victim waiting for a bullet. These were the hands that had mastered carrier landings in zero visibility, guiding a metal beast onto a moving speck in an unforgiving ocean. They were the hands that had wrestled a crippled A-1 Sky Raider back to Earth with its hydraulics shot out. These were the hands of a man trained in survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. When the guards secured Martin's now chillingly empty cage and returned to their posts, Dengler watched them with entirely different eyes. He was no longer a passive observer of his captors. He was an intelligence analyst gathering data. The fat one, a brute they privately called Crazy Horse, always settled into the same spot during his shift and reliably dozed off within 20 minutes. The young, nervous guard checked the cages in a predictable sequence, always moving clockwise around the compound and always pausing longest at the supply hut to steal fistfuls of rice. Even the stern one, the platoon sergeant, who was competent and alert, was a creature of habit, following his routine with a mechanical precision that created blind spots and exploitable patterns. For the first time in his 93 days of captivity, Dengler actively studied the compound instead of merely existing within its confines. The layout revealed itself as tactical terrain. 6 bamboo cages were arranged in a rough circle, a design meant for easy observation. 3 guard positions formed a loose triangle of control. A single supply hut and 1 main cook fire served as the camp's logistical heart. The perimeter was not defined by wire or walls, but by the seemingly impenetrable jungle itself. The Pathet Lao operated on the assumption that starvation, disease, and the hostile terrain were a prison more effective than any man-made structure. They were wrong, but only if a prisoner could move fast enough and far enough before the local Laotian forces could be mobilized to hunt him down. The sun finally broke over the canopy, and Dengler noted its angle with a pilot's precision. Due east. He instantly oriented the entire compound in his mind, mapping it against the memory of his flight path before his Skyraider had been hit. His destination was clear. Thailand lay to the west-southwest, a journey of roughly 80 to 100 kilometers through dense, enemy-held territory. The Mekong River formed the border, the final formidable obstacle. Reach the Mekong, cross into a neutral nation, and find friendly forces. The geography was simple. The journey was impossible for a starving man in leg irons, but staying meant the inevitable rifle shot in the ravine. Attempting escape meant a probable death from exposure, starvation, or recapture by a far more brutal party. The critical difference was agency. One was the certainty of death while waiting, the other was the possibility of death while trying. The choice, stripped of all complexities, clarified instantly and completely. He would attempt escape. The only question that remained was how. Dengler forced himself to eat the morning's sticky rice ball slowly, mechanically chewing each mouthful while his mind accelerated into a frantic planning mode. He took a brutal physical inventory of himself. His weight was down to perhaps 98 pounds from his normal fighting weight of 155. His leg irons were locked with a simple but sturdy pin mechanism he had been surreptitiously studying for weeks. Wrist restraints were only applied during transport and meals, an exploitable oversight. His physical condition had severely deteriorated, but it was not yet critical. The core of his strength remained. Most importantly, his survival training from the Navy's SEER School was still intact, a library of life-saving knowledge in his memory. His critical advantage was that he had studied jungle navigation and evasion tactics. His critical disadvantage was that the guards knew he was a trained pilot and likely suspected he had such skills. The other prisoners were no longer simply fellow sufferers. They became tactical factors in his equation. Jean de Bruin, a civilian pilot captured months before Dengler, was too weak and, more importantly, too psychologically resigned. He was a liability who wouldn't survive the attempt. YC. 2, a Chinese irregular fighting for the Americans, was physically stronger and, crucially, spoke Lao, allowing him to understand the guards' conversations. He was a possible ally if he could be convinced the risk was necessary. Fisit Intharathat, a Thai national, was an unpredictable variable, a man who might inform on an escape plot to curry favour with the guards. Each prisoner now represented a complex calculation, a variable of risk and opportunity, not sentiment. Throughout the morning, Dengler observed his surroundings with the same laser focus he'd once reserved for instrument panels during a storm-tossed carrier approach. The guards changed shifts at 0800, 1600, and midnight. The 15 minutes during each changeover were chaotic, creating moments of diffused attention as multiple guards moved about the compound. Crazy Horse's napping habit was a prime opportunity, but also risky, as the other guards would check on him at irregular intervals. The young guard's routine rice-stealing, however, happened every single shift, creating a reliable 3-minute window when his post was abandoned and his attention was fixed on the supply hut. The afternoon rain arrived at 14:30, with the same punctuality it had shown for weeks. Dengler sat in his cage as the deluge streamed through the bamboo slats, but he felt it differently now. This was not misery, it was concealment. The downpour reduced visibility to near zero, its drumming noise masked sound, and it created a perfect cover for movement. The guards invariably retreated to the relative dryness of the supply hut during these heavy downpours, huddling under the thatched roof, their attention focused on staying dry rather than watching prisoners. The rain was his ally, not his enemy. As the storm hammered against the bamboo, Dengler worked a splinter loose from the cage floor. It was 6 inches long and tapered naturally at one end. Hidden from view, he began to patiently smooth it against the rough fabric of his prison shirt, shaping it, feeling the texture with his fingertips, creating the precise taper he would need to manipulate the pin in his leg iron. The work was microscopic, painstaking, and invisible to any passing guard. This tiny splinter of wood became a tool, and in this place of absolute deprivation, a tool represented possibility. Night fell with the suddenness of a switched-off light. The guards' cooking fires illuminated the compound in a flickering orange glow that cast deep, dancing shadows and created pockets of absolute blackness. Dengler memorized the shadow patterns, identifying routes that remained in darkness. Just beyond the firelight's reach, the jungle pressed in, an impenetrable wall of black. That darkness was freedom, if only he could reach it. Crazy Horse took his position for the night shift. Within 18 minutes, his head slumped and his breathing shifted to the shallow rhythm of sleep. The young guard sat by the cook fire, engrossed in a bowl of rice. The sergeant walked his perimeter route, predictable as clockwork. And Dieter Dengler sat motionless in his bamboo cage, the precious bamboo splinter hidden against his palm, and committed his entire soul to the attempt. It would not be tonight. The timeline wasn't right, his preparations were incomplete, but it would be soon. A matter of days, not weeks. It had to be before the guards came for him, as they had come for Martin, before his physical condition deteriorated past the point where escape was even theoretically survivable, before the insidious tendrils of resignation could reclaim the raw determination that now burned in his chest like a banked fire. Under the cover of darkness, he tested the splinter against the leg iron's pin one more time, a subtle hidden movement. He applied precise pressure. The pin shifted fractionally, not enough to unlock, but enough to send a jolt of confirmation through him. The mechanism could be defeated. The cage could be opened. The jungle could be reached. And beyond the mountains and the jungle, Thailand lay waiting. Freedom waited, impossibly distant, but geometrically, tangibly real. The question in his mind had fundamentally shifted from whether to when. The answer would reveal itself through opportunity and desperation, in measures Dengler knew he would recognize when the moment finally arrived. Until then, there was only observation, preparation, the painstaking maintenance of his dwindling physical capability, and the cultivation of a defiant will against the crushing erosion of hope. Dengler lay on the hard bamboo slats as the compound settled into its nocturnal rhythm of insect buzz and distant animal calls. Somewhere beyond the firelight, creatures of the jungle moved through the darkness, navigating by instinct and an intimate knowledge of their terrain. Soon he would join them. He would become one of them, a hunted creature moving through a hostile world, propelled by the singular primal drive for survival. The transformation had already begun. He would escape. The decision was made, absolute and irrevocable, a new foundation for his existence. Death trying versus death waiting. He chose trying, and the planning began in earnest. Chapter 4. Dengler watched the guards, every movement, every pattern, every weakness. While others descended into despair, he counted footsteps, memorized shift changes, and studied how young guards grew lazy in the afternoon heat. Escape was not a matter of hope, it was survival math. The equation was simple: stay and die slowly, or run and die quickly. Running, at least, offered a choice. The decision crystallized on a night when rain hammered the bamboo roof and a fellow prisoner died quietly beside him, still shackled to the post. The man, another casualty of dysentery and starvation, simply stopped breathing. The guards didn't remove the corpse until morning. As Dengler lay manacled inches from death, something hardened inside him. It wasn't hope, it was pure cold determination. He would not die chained like an animal. The plan formed around a single observed weakness, the guards' casual arrogance. They believed starvation had broken the prisoners, that walking skeletons posed no threat. Consequently, they grew sloppy with the manacles, became distracted during daily routines, and were bored with their duty. Dengler noticed the locks were simple, pre-war French colonial issue, mass-produced and crude. As a man who had worked on complex aircraft systems, he understood mechanical principles. A lock was just pins and springs, and it could be defeated. The method crystallized during work details when guards marched them out to collect firewood. He studied the jungle perimeter, memorized the direction of river flows, and noted where trails disappeared into dense vegetation. He calculated distances, 5 kilometers to the river, perhaps 10 to the next village, maybe 30 to the Laos-Thailand border. These were impossible distances for starving men, but they were distances nonetheless. The timeline chose itself. The monsoon season meant swollen rivers and poor visibility for their hunters. The guards would stay inside during heavy rains. It was now or never. Recruiting began with Dwayne Martin, the other American pilot. An Air Force man shot down 3 weeks before Dengler. He was still strong enough to walk and angry enough to fight. Dengler approached him during a rare moment alone at the latrine, with the guards distant. He used just 4 words. "I'm getting out. You?" Martin's eyes sharpened, the first spark of life Dengler had seen in him for days. He nodded once. That was enough. Next came Pesidi, a Thai pilot who spoke Lao and understood the jungle, skills critical for evading villagers after the escape. It was a calculated risk. His knowledge was invaluable, but he might inform on them for better treatment. Dengler watched him for 3 days, noting the defiance in how he refused to bow during political lectures and took beatings without crying out. On the 4th day, Dengler whispered, "Can you navigate to Thailand?" Pesidi met his eyes. "If we run, they'll hunt us." It wasn't a refusal, but a reality check. "We stay. We die anyway," Dengler countered. Pesidi considered this for a long moment, then gave another decisive nod. The core team was 3. The other prisoners presented complications. Some were too weak, some too broken, some too afraid of the inevitable reprisals. Dengler made a brutal choice. He would only tell those who were essential. More men meant more chances for betrayal, more mouths to feed, and more bodies to coordinate in the chaos. He settled on including the remaining Thai prisoners, 4 more men, calculating that their escape would suggest a mass political kidnapping, creating confusion among the guards. But the core team remained 3, Dengler, Martin and Pesidi. The resources required were almost nothing, which was both the beauty and the terror of the plan. There would be no tunnel requiring tools, no disguises requiring materials, just 2 elements, unlocking the manacles and overpowering the guards. The necessary weapons already existed in the camp, the guards' own rifles and the machetes used for clearing brush. The prisoners simply had to take them. Speed and surprise would be everything. Preparation began with the locks. Dengler needed to practice, but every sound risked discovery. He used splinters of bamboo and wire from broken baskets, anything that could probe the mechanism. During political lectures, as guards droned on about American imperialism, his fingers worked beneath him, hidden by his crossed legs and the shadows. The lock's internal pins resisted, then yielded with a soft click. It was a silent, profound triumph. He practiced until he could do it in darkness, in the rain, in seconds. Each night, manacled to the post with the others, he would wait until the guards slept, work his lock free, and then refasten it before dawn. Testing, always testing. Once, a guard woke unexpectedly during his rounds. A flashlight beam swept across the prisoners. Dengler's hands were moving. the lock half open. He froze, every muscle rigid, holding his breath. The guard lingered, suspicious. 5 seconds passed. 10. Dengler's heart hammered so hard he thought it would wake everyone. Finally, the guard, bored, moved on. The lock snapped shut under Dengler's trembling fingers. That close. Gathering food meant hoarding already microscopic rations, hiding rice in bamboo joints, and stealing from the guard stores during work details. Pisidi managed to pocket a handful of salt, an invaluable resource for preventing dehydration during jungle travel. Each grain was accounted for and divided among hidden caches. The physical preparation was agony. Dengler forced himself to exercise despite starvation, doing push-ups in the darkness, flexing muscles that screamed to atrophy. Martin did the same. They needed strength for the first sprint, the first fight. If they couldn't overpower the guards in the initial seconds, the plan would fail. Dengler's body pleaded for rest, for the conservation of precious calories, but he drove himself relentlessly. 10 push-ups, 20. His legs shook, his arms burned. The other prisoners watched with a mixture of admiration and pity, thinking he was losing his mind. A near disaster came 12 days before the planned escape. An informer, one of the weaker prisoners desperate for favor, noticed the unusual activity. He approached a guard during a work detail, started talking, and gestured toward Dengler and Martin. Pisidi saw it happen, caught Dengler's eye, and tilted his head towards the conversation. Dengler's blood went cold. The guard listened, looked toward the Americans, and started walking over. Everything hung on the next 30 seconds. Dengler made a choice born of pure desperation. He collapsed, falling into the mud, with his eyes rolling back, his body convulsing. It was the performance of his life. Martin shouted for help, and guards rushed over, the informer forgotten in the commotion. They threw water on Dengler and slapped his face. He groaned, played unconscious, and let them drag him back to camp. The informer's warning was lost in the chaos, dismissed as the paranoid rambling of a starving man. It was too close. That night, Dengler considered abandoning the plan. Then he looked at the dead man's empty spot by the post, and his resolve hardened. The informer would be left behind. Testing the method came in fragments. During another work detail, Dengler positioned himself near a guard's rifle, measured the distance, and calculated that it would take 3 steps to reach it. He rehearsed the movement in his mind 1,000 times. Grab, turn, fire. The guard was young, maybe 19, and barely trained. His inexperience was an advantage. Pisidi tested the jungle routes during authorized trips to collect water, memorizing landmarks and identifying which paths led to villages versus deep wilderness. He reported back in whispers. The river was high with a strong but passable current. The trail west showed recent foot traffic and was dangerous. The trail south was overgrown and thus a better option. Every piece of intelligence was critical, stored in memory, as nothing could be written down. The psychological pressure mounted like a physical weight. Dengler woke each morning wondering if this was the day the guards would discover the loosened nails in the bamboo wall, the hidden rice caches, or the rope he'd woven from plant fibers. Martin grew tense, snapping at minor frustrations, his eyes constantly darting toward the guards. Pisidi became quieter, withdrawing into himself. An older Thai prisoner, too sick to travel, pressed a small bundle into Dengler's hands one night. It was dried fish, saved from somewhere. "Go," he whispered in broken English. "Tell them we existed." Another prisoner begged them not to try, certain the guards would execute everyone in reprisal. His fear was justified, as collective punishment was standard. But Dengler had already calculated this. Death by execution was faster than death by starvation. It was a cruel math, but the only math that mattered. He gambled by forcing himself to eat the hoarded food to regain strength, using reserves before they were truly needed. He felt marginally stronger, less lightheaded. Martin did the same. Pisidi remained skeletal, but his eyes burned with determination. June 29th, 1966. The date arrived with terrifying speed. Morning dawned grey and heavy. By afternoon, clouds massed overhead, dark and promising. The plan required night and the next guard shift. Dengler waited, watching everything. His years of pilot training, of controlling fear during combat, paid dividends now. His hands were steady. Martin was less controlled, vibrating with tension, but holding together. Pisidi was pure ice. Dengler rehearsed every movement. Unlock manacles, rush the guard, take the rifle, shoot, grab machetes, release others, run south. 7 steps, 7 places where death waited. Any mistake would mean failure. The last meal was the usual handful of rice, this time with extra worms. Dengler ate it, needing every calorie. He looked at Martin, then at Pisidi. There were no speeches, no dramatic farewells, just eye contact, a shared acknowledgement. This was probably death, but it was a death they had chosen, not one they would accept. The afternoon dragged on. During a routine inspection, a guard lingered near the bamboo post, tugging on Dengler's chains. The lock, which Dengler had refastened, held. The guard moved on. Another bullet dodged. The waiting was its own form of torture. Darkness fell around 1900 hours. The rain started at 1930, perfect timing. Heavy drops hammered the bamboo, reducing visibility and masking sound. The guard shift changed at 2000 hours. The new guards were the lazy ones, the ones who would shelter from the rain instead of maintaining vigilance. Dengler watched them through gaps in the bamboo. At 2030, the central guard moved towards the hut. Now, Dengler's hands moved to his manacles. The wire probed the lock, the pins lifted, the mechanism turned. Click, right hand free, left hand, click, legs, click, click, he was loose. Martin watched, his eyes wide. Dengler reached over and worked Martin's locks, his practiced movements faster now. Free, then Pisidi. The other Thai prisoners stirred, realizing what was happening. One started to speak, but Dengler pressed a finger to his lips. Silence. The guard at the perimeter stood 30 feet away, facing out into the jungle, his attention on staying dry. Dengler rose slowly, his legs trembling from weeks of inactivity. Martin was beside him. The bamboo door wasn't locked. Dengler pushed it open into the deafening rain. The guard didn't turn. Dengler stepped into the mud, moving toward a machete leaning against a post. His hand closed around the rough wooden handle. Martin grabbed a second machete, and Pisidi found a heavy length of bamboo. The perimeter guard finally sensed movement and started to turn. Dengler was already running. 3 steps, just as he'd calculated. The guard's eyes widened, his mouth opening to shout. Dengler swung the machete not at the man, but at the rifle strap. The blade cut through, and the rifle fell. As the guard lunged for it, Martin hit him from the side. The man went down. Dengler grabbed the rifle and checked the chamber. It was loaded. The second guard emerged from the hut, shouting and raising his weapon. Dengler fired first. The rifle kicked, the sound enormous even through the downpour. The guard spun and fell. As the third guard appeared, chaos erupted. Prisoners scattered. Martin grabbed another rifle while Pisidi shouted in Thai, directing the others. Dengler fired again, suppressing the third guard and forcing him back into the hut. Then they were running. South, into the darkness, into the rain, into the jungle that meant death, but also freedom. Behind them, shouts and whistles echoed as the alarm spread. They crashed through the undergrowth, branches tearing at their skin, mud sucking at their feet. Martin was beside him, breathing hard. Pisidi was ahead, navigating by instinct. The first 100 meters were pure terror, a frantic dash expecting bullets at any moment. Then the camp lights faded behind them. They were beyond the wire, running into a hostile jungle with no supplies and no plan beyond survival. Dengler's lungs burned, but he ran on. The manacles were gone. The bamboo hut was behind him. Death was probable, but no longer certain. For the first time in 7 months he was free. The jungle swallowed them whole, and the real fight for survival began. Laotian guards stood helpless as this American pilot unlocked his cuffs and disappeared. Chapter 5. The jungle swallowed Dengler whole seconds after he cleared the compound wire, but his illusion of safety lasted only 4 steps. His bare feet hit mud and elephant grass, legs pumping on pure adrenaline despite months of starvation turning his muscles to string. The monsoon forest of northern Laos stretched in every direction, dense, alive, and utterly indifferent to whether he lived or died in its embrace. Behind him the camp remained silent. No shouts yet, no alarm. The guards wouldn't discover the empty huts for another 2 hours until morning rice distribution. 2 hours, maybe 3 if the Pathit Lao sentries were lazy. Dengler crashed through undergrowth, branches slashing his face, thorns ripping his prison uniform. His hands were still cuffed in front of him, the steel shackles he'd unlocked from his ankles now his only tools. He clutched them against his chest, the metal warm from body heat, and forced himself to think through the panic screaming in his skull. West, he needed to go west, toward Thailand, toward freedom. 200 miles of jungle and mountains stood between him and the Mekong River border. 200 miles with no food, no shoes, no water, no map, no compass, nothing but the desperate need to survive that had kept him breathing through 7 months of hell. His lungs burned. The air itself felt thick as soup, humid and hot even in pre-dawn darkness. Dengler stumbled over a root, went down hard on his knees, tasted blood where he'd bitten his tongue. For 1 terrible second, his body refused to move. 7 months of beatings and starvation had carved away everything except the skeleton of who he'd been. He weighed maybe 90 pounds now, down from the 165 he'd carried before his A1 Sky Raider was shot down over Laos in February. Muscles atrophied, feet infected and swollen, wrists raw from the cuffs, ribs visible through skin like parchment. But fear proved stronger than exhaustion. Fear and the memory of Fisit, the Thai prisoner, dying in the pit because he'd tried to escape. Fear of the bamboo cages, fear of starvation, fear of dying here, forgotten. His mother never knowing what happened to her son who'd survived Nazi Germany only to vanish into Southeast Asian jungle. Dengler pushed himself up, kept moving. The forest floor sucked at his feet with each step, mud and rotting vegetation and things that squirmed against his toes. The canopy blocked the pre-dawn light, limiting his vision to 10 feet. Navigation meant nothing except away from the camp, deeper into wilderness, putting distance between himself and the moment discovery would trigger pursuit. A stream appeared suddenly, black water moving fast over rocks. Dengler didn't hesitate. He waded in, the current threatening to sweep his weakened legs from under him. The water came to his chest, shockingly cold after the jungle heat. He let it carry him downstream for 100 yards, hoping to break any scent trail, then clawed his way up the opposite bank. His hands were nearly useless with the cuffs still on. The steel had rubbed his wrists raw months ago. Now every movement sent fresh blood trickling down his palms. But the cuffs also served as weapons, brass knuckles if it came to that. Dengler had seen what the guards did to recaptured prisoners. He'd die fighting before going back. The jungle thickened. Massive teak trees rose like cathedral pillars, their roots creating a maze of obstacles that had to be climbed over or crawled under. Vines hung everywhere, some as thick as his arm, others thin as wire and just as sharp. Mosquitoes came in clouds, biting through his rags, but Dengler barely noticed. Pain had become his constant companion, so familiar he'd stopped registering it as anything unusual. What terrified him was the absence of sound. The jungle should have been alive with noise, birds and monkeys creating the dawn chorus. Instead, silence pressed down like physical weight. Wrong. Something was wrong. Dengler froze, every sense straining. Then he heard it, distant but unmistakable. The metallic clang of the morning gong at the camp. Roll call. They discovered the escape. 2 miles away, the compound exploded into chaos. The young Pathet Lao guard named Baunmi made the discovery when he entered the bamboo hut to rouse prisoners for morning rice. 5 men should have been lying on the sleeping platform. Only 3 remained. For a second, Baunmi's mind rejected what he saw. Prisoners didn't escape. Prisoners were too weak, too broken, too afraid. The camp had stood for 3 years without a single successful escape. Then reality hit like cold water. 2 prisoners gone. The American pilot and the Thai. Baunmi screamed for the sergeant, his young voice cracking with terror. Within seconds, every guard converged on the hut. Camp Commandant Prasong arrived last, his face twisting from irritation to fury as he processed the scene. The Americans and the Thai had vanished. The crude shackle locks lay open on the sleeping platform, picked with wire the guards had somehow missed during searches. A hole had been dug under the rear bamboo wall, concealed until this moment behind the sleeping prisoners' bodies. Prasong's roar shook the compound. He grabbed Baunmi by the throat, slamming him against a hut post hard enough to crack it. The other prisoners, still shackled, pressed themselves against the far wall as the commandant's rage found its first target. The sergeant intervened, pulling Prasong back, whispering urgent words about pursuit, about finding the escapees before they reached Thai territory. Prasong released Baunmi, who collapsed gasping and turned his fury toward action. His orders were rapid fire, delivered with absolute authority and barely controlled violence. The remaining prisoners were to be locked in the bamboo cage immediately. No food, no water until the escapees were recaptured. Guards were to assemble for pursuit. The dogs would be unleashed. Radio contact would be established with Pathet Lao patrols in surrounding villages. Civilian informers would be activated. Every resource would be deployed. 2 prisoners had embarrassed him, had made him look weak and incompetent to his superiors. They would be found, they would be brought back, and they would die as examples. The camp's 2 dogs, half-wild mongrels kept specifically for tracking, were brought to the escape hole. They hit the scent immediately, baying with an excitement that sent ice through the remaining prisoners' hearts. The handler, an older soldier named Kam, let the dogs pull him toward the jungle. Behind him, 12 guards assembled with Soviet-supplied AK-47s and enough rice for 3 days of pursuit. Prasong watched them disappear into the forest, then turned back to the compound. The remaining prisoners were being dragged from the hut, still shackled, and thrown into the punishment cage. Jean de Bruin, the CIA contract pilot, looked at Prasong with flat acceptance, knowing what came next. Prasong ignored him. His attention had already shifted to the radio, composing the message that American prisoners had escaped and were to be hunted down like animals. Dengler heard the dogs. The sound carried through jungle with terrible clarity, their excited barking mixing with handlers' shouts. They were coming, fast. He abandoned all attempt at stealth and simply ran. The forest became a blur of green and brown, thorns and vines, mud and streams. His feet barely touched ground before lifting for the next step, heart hammering against ribs, lungs pulling air in great gasping sobs. The handcuffs bounced against his chest, the metal leaving bruises he wouldn't notice for days. A ravine appeared without warning. Dengler tried to stop, couldn't, and tumbled over the edge in a tangle of limbs and vegetation. He hit the bottom 20 feet down, landing in a stream bed that knocked the wind from his lungs. For several seconds he lay there, unable to breathe, unable to move. Black spots dancing across his vision. The dogs sounded much closer. Terror accomplished what willpower couldn't. Dengler sucked air into his lungs and forced his body upright. The stream bed offered cover, a natural highway through the jungle. He followed it downstream, moving as fast as the slick rocks and weakened legs allowed. Behind him, the pursuit sounds changed. The dogs had reached the ravine edge. They were coming down. Dengler saw the cave entrance purely by accident. A dark slash in the limestone cliff face, half hidden by vines. No time to think, only react. He threw himself into the opening, crawling on hands and knees through mud and bat guano into absolute darkness. The cave mouth was barely wider than his shoulders. Inside, the space opened up enough to crouch. Dengler pressed himself against the back wall, breathing through his mouth to stay silent, and waited. The dogs arrived 90 seconds later. Dengler could hear them splashing in the stream, their barking echoing off stone walls. The handler's voice called commands in Lao, angry and frustrated. The dogs had lost the scent in the water. They cast back and forth, whining now instead of barking, confused by the stream and the ravine and the 100 different scents the jungle offered. Dengler held absolutely still. A single sound, one breath too loud, and the dogs would find the cave. He could see their shadows moving past the vine-covered entrance, black shapes against grey dawn light. His heart hammered so hard he was certain they'd hear it. One of the dogs paused directly at the cave mouth, its nose pushed through the vines, sniffing, searching. Dengler stopped breathing entirely. The dog whined, took a step closer. Then the handler called it back, his voice sharp with command. The patrol was moving on, searching downstream, following the water where logic said the escapee must have gone. The sounds faded. Dengler remained frozen for another 10 minutes, every muscle locked before allowing himself to breathe normally. He'd survived, for now, but he knew the truth with absolute certainty. They would come back. They would search again. The cave bought him hours at most, not safety. And Fissit, his fellow escapee, was somewhere out there in the jungle, also being hunted. They'd separated at the stream, agreeing that 2 targets were harder to track than 1. Dengler didn't know if the Thai was still free or already recaptured. All he knew was that when darkness came again, he had to move west, always west. Toward Thailand, toward home, toward freedom that remained 200 miles and 1,000 dangers away. His vision blurred. The exhaustion he'd held at bay through pure adrenaline crashed over him like a wave. Dengler's eyes closed. In the darkness of the cave, with pursuit temporarily fooled and death temporarily delayed, his body simply stopped. Chapter 6. Dieter Dengler was a 90-pound skeleton on June 29, 1966, when he made his move. Every rib showed through skin stretched tight over his emaciated frame. His hands, however, were steady as he worked the nail he'd stolen weeks prior into the ancient padlock, securing his leg irons. The guards dozed in the midday heat, their rifles propped against the bamboo fence. They had grown lazy, watching prisoners too weak to stand without swaying. They failed to notice the American pilot's fingers moving with surgical precision, feeling for the mechanism inside the lock he'd studied for months. 1 tumbler, 2. The lock sprang open. Dengler froze, watching the nearest guard's chest rise and fall, still sleeping. He caught Dwayne Martin's eye across the compound, who gave a single sharp nod. The other prisoners, Thai, Chinese and Vietnamese, sensed the shift. Jean de Bruin looked up from his corner, saw Dengler free of his chains, and understood. This was it, the impossible moment they'd whispered about in darkness but never truly believed would come. Dengler stood, his legs nearly buckling. Malaria and dysentery had hollowed him into a husk animated by pure will. He took 1 step. The guard shifted but did not wake. Another step. Martin was now freeing himself, using a piece of wire on his own restraints. The afternoon silence was broken only by cicadas screaming in the jungle heat. Dengler reached to the fence, his hands closing on bamboo poles lashed with rotting vine. The poles were as thick as his wrists had once been. Now his wrists were like a child's. He tested the lashing. It was weak. Everything here was falling apart, including the guard's vigilance. He worked a pole loose, creating a gap barely wide enough for his skeletal frame. Behind him, Martin was free. De Bruin moved to follow, but the other prisoners merely watched, their hollow eyes calculating chances they knew they were too weak to take. Dengler slid through the gap, bamboo scraping his protruding ribs and drawing blood he didn't feel. He was in the jungle, the dense green wall that surrounded the camp. Martin followed close behind, but De Bruin hesitated at the fence, turning back toward his shackled compatriots. The hesitation was his undoing. A guard stirred, opened his eyes, and saw the gap in the fence. A sharp, panicked shout shattered the calm. Rifles clattered as guards scrambled awake. Dengler didn't look back. He ran. His bare feet found roots, thorns, and sharp rocks as his legs pumped on muscle memory from a time when he was whole. Now each step was a gamble. Martin crashed through the undergrowth beside him. Behind them, chaos erupted in the camp. Gunfire cracked, bullets snapping through the leaves overhead. They ran deeper into the jungle, following no path, just away from the camp and the execution they knew awaited those who remained. The jungle swallowed them. Within 50 meters, the camp sounds faded, consumed by the jungle's own roar of alarmed birds and insects. Dengler's lungs burned, his vision tunneled. He was running on the last reserves of a body that had nothing left. Martin, breathing like a bellows, kept pace, his feet bleeding. They couldn't speak. Every breath was precious, every ounce of energy directed towards survival. The jungle was impossibly dense. Vines caught their legs and thorns tore their skin. They pushed through wait-a-minute bushes that grabbed and held, Dengler tearing free and leaving skin behind. Blood ran down his legs, but he couldn't stop. The Pathet Lao guards were no longer lazy. They were hunting. After 30 minutes of blind flight, Dengler's legs gave out. He crashed to the jungle floor, chest heaving, his vision sparking with black dots. Martin collapsed beside him. They lay in the rot and mud, gasping like landed fish as the green, wet jungle pressed in on all sides. Dengler mentally catalogued their situation. They were somewhere in northern Laos, location unknown. The nearest American forces were dozens of miles away in Thailand or South Vietnam. They had no food, water, map, compass, or shoes. Their entire survival kit consisted of a small knife Martin had hidden for weeks. 2 dying men against the world's most hostile jungle. They rested for only 10 minutes. The pursuit would be organized, likely by trackers who knew the jungle intimately and could read broken branches like a map. They stood and moved on, Dengler picking a direction, west toward Thailand, on pure instinct. The jungle resisted every step. Within an hour, their shredded feet left a bloody trail any tracker could follow. They tried walking in shallow, rocky streams to hide their passage, but the agony was immense. They compromised, following stream beds when possible and cutting through jungle when necessary, always moving west, gambling that the next valley would bring them closer to safety. Night fell like a black curtain, transforming the jungle into a nightmare where they couldn't see, and every sound was a potential threat. They huddled against a fallen log, shivering despite the heat. Malaria burned through Dengler in waves, his body shaking uncontrollably. Martin whispered that they needed water soon, or the jungle would kill them before the guards could. Dengler knew he was right. Dehydration was already slowing his thoughts, but they couldn't risk moving in darkness. They endured the night, waking at every sound, waiting for dawn. First light brought no relief. In the triple canopy jungle, sunlight barely penetrated. The air was thick with moisture, but offered nothing to drink. They found a tiny stream and drank greedily from the earthy, foul-tasting water, knowing it might carry parasites, but that dehydration would kill them faster. Dengler recalled his survival training at Pensacola, but it had assumed a man with a survival kit and strength, not a skeleton animated by desperation. They were 2 ghosts stumbling through a green hell. They walked for 3 days, their progress immeasurable. They ate whatever they could find. Leaves they prayed weren't poisonous, grubs from rotting logs. It was never enough. Dengler's body continued to consume itself. His mind played tricks, vivid hallucinations of his German childhood, pulling him from reality until Martin's voice or the constant agony brought him back. Martin was fading too. He used his knife to open a small, rat-like animal, and they ate it raw, too fearful of a fire's smoke. The meat provided a burst of energy, enough for another hour. On the 4th day, they heard it, the unmistakable sound of rotor blades. An American helicopter. Hope exploded in their chests. They scrambled toward the sound, but the canopy was too thick. Finding a tiny clearing, Dengler waved his arms, screaming until his throat was raw. Martin jumped and waved beside him. The helicopter passed directly overhead. Then the sound faded. They stood as it disappeared, their arms dropping, the brief flame of hope extinguished. They were invisible in the green ocean. Martin cracked first. His feet were infected, red lines of sepsis crawling up his calves, and a fever glazed his eyes. He sat down hard and declared he couldn't go on. The look in his eyes was one of surrender, of a body shutting down. Dengler refused to accept it. He pulled Martin to his feet, half carrying him, forcing them both to continue west, toward the impossible dream of rescue. Dengler's own body was failing, his vision blurring and thoughts fragmenting, but he wouldn't stop. Stopping was death. By day 5, Martin couldn't walk. Dengler tried pleading, then threats, but Martin just shook his head. He was done. He told Dengler to go on, to save himself. Dengler refused. They had come this far together, but Martin was dead weight. Dengler made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He promised Martin he would find help and come back for him. Leaving Martin the knife, he positioned him near a stream where he could reach water. Then he walked away, each step an agony of guilt and necessity. Alone, Dengler pushed harder. Without Martin, the jungle pressed in tighter. He talked to himself, reciting German prayers and training songs to keep his mind tethered to sanity. His body was on autopilot. He fell and rose, fell and rose. The mantra that kept him alive was simple: get up, move. On day 7, he found a village of 6 small huts. He was too far gone to care if it was Pathet Lao. He needed food or he would die. He emerged from the jungle, arms raised. An old woman screamed. Men rushed out with machetes. Dengler tried to speak, to say American, but only croaks came out. The men surrounded him, shouting in Lao. One raised a machete. Dengler closed his eyes, waiting for the end. Instead, hands grabbed him, dragged him to a hut, and threw him inside. He lay on the dirt floor, unable to care what came next. For hours or days, he drifted in and out of consciousness. Hands forced water and rice into his mouth, which he swallowed automatically, while villagers argued above him. The malaria burned through his brain, bringing visions of his mother, his flaming sky raider, and Martin lying in the jungle. Then English, American voices. Dengler forced his eyes open to see a soldier kneeling beside him, calling for a medivac. The soldier's face went white at the sight of Dengler's frame. He asked for a name, rank, and serial number. Dengler's lips moved, but no sound came out. The soldier touched his shoulder. "Help is coming," he said. "You're safe now." Safe. The word meant nothing. The soldier explained they had picked up his signal and convinced the village headman to shelter him. Signal? Dengler had nothing to signal with. The soldier showed him a piece of metal, his own ID tag, lost in the jungle. Villagers had found it, recognized the American markings, and sent word to Thai border guards, who contacted US forces. It was blind luck, the random chance separating death from deliverance. As the helicopter came, Hans lifted Dengler onto a stretcher. He tried to tell them about Martin, but the words wouldn't form. The soldier leaned close. "We'll search," he promised. The helicopter lifted, and Dengler looked down at the green hell he had escaped. 23 days from shoot-down to rescue. The numbers would be studied, but as he rose above the jungle, Dengler felt only hollow exhaustion. His body was safe, but his mind had not yet caught up. They never found Dwayne Martin alive. A week later, search teams located his body. He had been killed by villagers. The news reached Dengler in a hospital bed in Thailand, where doctors fought to save him from infections and severe malnutrition. The guilt hit harder than any bullet. He had survived. Martin hadn't. Jean de Bruin and the others left in the camp had been executed or died shortly after. Dengler was the only one who made it out, free, rescued, and on his way home, Dengler found the jungle wasn't finished with him. It lived in his nightmares, in the way he hoarded food, in the panic attacks that struck without warning. The visible and invisible scars would define the rest of his life. The war wasn't over. The real battle, learning to live while others died, was just beginning. Chapter 7. The legacy Dieter Dengler returned to the United States on July 20th, 1966, weighing 98 pounds. After 3 weeks of intensive medical care in the Philippines and Hawaii for malnutrition, intestinal parasites and severe infections in his wounded feet, his debriefing began. Intelligence officers wanted everything: guard rotations, interrogation techniques, camp layouts, and the location of other prisons. Dengler provided what became a 200-page classified report detailing 6 months of captivity. The information was so valuable that the Navy kept the full debriefing classified secret for 23 years, meaning even his own family never knew what he told the government or why it mattered so much. The Navy awarded him the Navy Cross in 1966, its second highest decoration. The citation mentioned extraordinary heroism during an extremely daring escape from a Pathet Lao prison camp, but omitted the failed first attempt, the fellow prisoners who died, or the intelligence his suffering would provide. After receiving the Distinguished Flying Cross and Air Medal, he was quietly returned to flying status, completing 2 more combat tours in Vietnam. Colleagues noticed a profound change. He never complained about carrier food or uncomfortable ready room temperatures. He had learned what real hunger felt like and what real heat meant. Everything else was a luxury. In 1968, Dengler married, and a year later he left active duty for the Naval Reserve, eventually retiring as a commander. He moved to California, working first as a commercial pilot and then as a test pilot. For 15 years, he rarely spoke of the camps. The reasons for his silence were twofold. First, his intelligence report remained operationally sensitive throughout the Vietnam War. Second, Dengler himself chose it. Haunted by the friends who didn't make it, Jean de Bruin, Duane Martin, and the Thai prisoners whose fates were unknown, he resisted the spotlight. "I lived because of luck, not courage," he once told his brother. "Why should I get famous while they stay forgotten?" His wife knew he'd been a POW, but he never shared the brutal details of eating snakeheads or watching executions. The nightmares told her enough, as he'd wake up swinging at phantom enemies, shouting a frantic mix of German, English, and the law he had learned to survive. Following a brief article about his escape in a 1979 military aviation magazine, the story once again faded. But within military circles, his story lived on. SEER instructors at the Navy School in Brunswick, Maine, learned of the escape from intelligence personnel who had read the classified debriefing. After partial declassification in 1983, Dengler's techniques began appearing in resistance training curricula. His method of memorizing guard patterns by repetitive counting and his improvised compass, crafted from wire, became standard teaching points. Most significantly, his decision to diligently gather intelligence while captive, then share it comprehensively upon return, became a case study in compliance with Article 5 of the Code of Conduct. The public rediscovery began in 1997 with German filmmaker Werner Herzog. Intrigued by a footnote about the German immigrant-turned-Navy pilot in an aviation history book, Herzog contacted Dengler. The result was the documentary Little Dieter Needs to Fly. Dengler agreed to participate on one condition: Herzog must also tell Jean de Bruin's story. The powerful film took Dengler back to Laos, where he walked his escape route, demonstrating his survival skills, catching snakes, fashioning a raft, opening handcuffs with a nail. Watching the 50-year-old move through the jungle with purpose, viewers understood this was not recreation, but memory made physical. The documentary changed everything. Dengler began giving interviews to military historians, speaking at SEER schools, and participating in POW remembrance events. In 2001, he testified before a congressional committee investigating unresolved POW MIA cases, speaking about De Bruin and other men whose fates remained unknown. His testimony entered the official record. Researchers, now able to cross-reference his 1966 debriefing with newly declassified Pathet Lao archives, found that every detail he had reported, camp locations, dates, guard descriptions, held up under scrutiny. In 2006, Herzog's dramatic adaptation, Rescue Dawn, starring Christian Bale, brought Dengler's story to millions. Though it took cinematic liberties, the film cemented his legacy in the public consciousness. Veterans groups used its inspiring story as a recruiting tool, and the USS Midway Museum in San Diego added a permanent display featuring his flight gear, rescue photographs, and excerpts from his declassified debriefing, placing his name alongside other aviation legends. Today, Dieter Dengler's experience informs multiple facets of military training and policy. At the Navy's SEER school, his approach to intelligence gathering, observe everything, commit details to memory, share comprehensively upon return, is a core tenet. The psychological resilience section of the curriculum uses his testimony about maintaining hope through small, achievable goals, reaching the next tree, surviving the next hour, making it one more day. The Air Force's Intelligence School at Goodfellow Air Force Base uses his fully declassified 200-page report as a case study in systematic collection and reporting. Analysts study how he meticulously structured information on camp layouts, guard schedules, and fellow prisoners. His report became a template, with its principles influencing debriefing protocols used for personnel recovered from later conflicts, including Navy SEAL Marcus Luttrell and Army Specialist Jessica Lynch. Furthermore, Dengler's story, though often told without his name, powerfully illustrates the code of conduct. His continuous intelligence gathering exemplifies Article 3, I will continue to resist by all means available. His lifelong fight for the recognition of his fellow prisoners embodies Article 4, I will keep faith with my fellow prisoners. Dieter Dengler died on February 7, 2001, at age 62, from ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. The progressive muscle failure was a bitter irony for a man whose body had survived starvation and walked through jungle hell. Friends said his final months in a wheelchair, unable to fly or even feed himself, felt like a new form of captivity. The funeral at Arlington National Cemetery drew hundreds, fellow pilots, SEER instructors, Vietnam veterans, and one elderly Thai man from the prison camp who had survived the war and spent 30 years searching for the American pilot who had opened the gate. His legacy was being solidified in stone and memory. The National Museum of Naval Aviation in Pensacola features his flight helmet and rescue photos in its POW exhibit. The Navy placed a bronze plaque at the Test Pilot School in Patuxent River, Maryland, where he worked after retirement. Engraved with the words "survived because he refused to quit," it is now a tradition for graduates to touch it for luck before their first solo flights. In 2008, the physical proof of his story was unearthed. Researchers investigating POW MIA cases used Dengler's debriefing to locate the camp clearing in Laos. Though the buildings were gone, they found remnants of the handcuff system, with metal plates bolted to wooden beams exactly as he had sketched in 1966. They found the tree line where he had run, but they did not find Jean De Bruin, whose family continues to search. What Dengler came to understand and tried to explain in his final interviews was that escape was meaningless without a purpose beyond it. He survived not to be famous, but to testify for the missing. The intelligence he provided helped plan rescues, and the techniques he demonstrated prepared thousands for captivity. His reluctant telling of his story was a reminder that wars don't end until the missing are accounted for. This sense of righteousness was felt even by those who had once been his enemy. When researchers visited a village near the Nam U River in 2008, old men still remembered the half-dead American who walked out of the forest in 1966. They recalled giving him food and hiding him. When told that the pilot had survived and lived a full life, one villager smiled. "Good," he said through a translator. "He deserved to live. He was very, very strong." That strength, not cinematic heroism, but the grinding, unglamorous endurance that keeps a person going, is the core of his legacy. At survival, evasion, resistance, and escape schools, across all services, instructors tell students, "You will want to quit. Your body will fail. Your mind will break." In that moment, remember this: a German immigrant pilot, tortured for 6 months, walked for 23 days on infected feet because quitting meant dying. Small goals, next tree, next hour, next step. That's how you survive. Not through one heroic moment. Through 10,000 small refusals to surrender. The code of conduct that Dengler exemplified exists because men like him proved it possible to resist, to escape, and to keep faith under impossible conditions. His story is not just inspiration, it is instruction, a blueprint for the next pilot shot down, the next soldier captured, the next person facing a choice between surrender and one more step forward. 10,000 times he chose forward. That choice outlived his body. It lives in training manuals, in museum displays, and in the continuing search for men like Jean de Bruin, a recognition that survival creates an obligation that lasts a lifetime. Dieter Dengler unlocked his handcuffs and walked out of hell. Then he spent 35 years trying to bring the others home. That is the story. Not the escape, but what came after.